Chris Ferrara, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. Thanks. I really like the idea of this forum, these unscripted conversations about the state of affairs in the church.
Yeah, you know, it's become more and less necessary since I think you've probably been aware of the fact that the neo-Catholics are really ratcheting up their attack on really not only on traditionalism, but on traditionalists themselves. We're seeing more and more of these sort of trolling the comm boxes of blog sites to find kooks that offer incriminating indictments of the traditionalist position or mischaracterizations of the traditionalist positions, and then the whole traditional movement is being attacked by our neo-Catholic friends based on these things. And so I don't know, it's very difficult to kind of keep up with the attacks that are based on daily blogs. What do you think? I think we've got to make an effort.
What is up with these people? And we're in the middle of a total collapse of faith and discipline in the church. Paul VI said right after the Second Vatican Council, the smoke of Satan has entered the church through the windows that were supposed to let in the fresh air. He said that I will confide to you who is behind this interference in the church. His name is the devil. The Pope is saying this. Cardinal Ratzinger spoke of a period of decomposition or decay, a process of continuing decay in the church since the council. He spoke of the collapse of the liturgy as being central to the crisis in the church. John Paul II spoke of a silent apostasy throughout the once Catholic Western world, not long before his pontificate and his life ended. The church is in a state of absolute chaos, and here they are wasting radio time talking about this mythical, radical traditionalist threat. Don't they have anything better to do?
Define neo-Catholic today.
Well, the unprecedented situation in which we find ourselves today is that the majority of the church, and we're all Catholics, obviously, and we're not talking about excluding anyone from the church, although they do it constantly when they denounce the schism, so-called, of traditionalists. The situation we have is that Catholics, by and large, have been liberalized by a series of reforms in the church that have no precedent in church history. The neo-Catholic is analogous to the neo-conservative in secular politics. He's sort of conservative, but then again, he's sort of liberal. A neo-Catholic may be, doctrinally speaking, perfectly Catholic. He may affirm every teaching of the church. He may point to the catechism and say, I subscribe to every page of it. He can recite the creed with us. The problem is that in practice, he has consented to undermine and is in fact participating in the undermining of everything he professes to believe. For example, he'll say, of course, the Mass is a sacrifice. And yet he sits there at a Novus Ordo innovative Mass where there's a priest presiding over an altar table facing the people. The Holy Eucharist is distributed by lay ministers with unconsecrated hands. The music is horrific. It's folk music, twanging guitars, tinkling pianos. There's nothing that resembles the august ceremonies that should attend the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Everything he participates in terms of practice undermines what he professes to believe. And many of them even deplore the new liturgy, and yet they continue to participate in it and to denounce us as nostalgists, merely because we seek to restore the traditional received and approved Roman rite of the Catholic Church.
If it were just nostalgists, I guess I would almost be more content with that. But you know, we just saw this past week that Phil Lawler from CatholicCulture.org recommended a blog site that all of his readers should read. I don't think we even need to necessarily mention which of the many blog sites, but he said this is a fair and balanced appraisal of the situation with the Franciscans of the Friars of the Immaculate. And if you look at this blog site and you see that this man leads with the fact that traditional Catholics he refers to them once again as radical traditionalists, a term that you and I both know was coined by the far left, rabidly liberal Southern Poverty Law Center. And we see this again and again. We saw Catholic Answers Live do the same thing, use the same term. Now we have Phil Lawler recommending blogs that use the same term, radical traditionalists, which of course means anti-Semite, Holocaust revisionist, and all these things, which absolutely is not accurate, not true in the least, and yet they just throw it out there and hope it sticks.
Well, again, I ask, why are they so concerned with this phantom threat of the radical traditionalists who are not a threat at all, when they're surrounded by apostasy and the collapse of faith and discipline in the church? Why doesn't Catholic Answers do a continuing series on the liturgical disaster, or the penetration of the seminaries by modernist theology,
Sure.
or the emptying out of the convents, or the destruction of the Catholic school system, or the closing down of parishes because people are walking away in droves from the so-called
sure.
Reformed liturgy? But this particular blog site that you mentioned, which according to Philip Lola gives us a fair and balanced and admirably charitable discussion of the controversy over the Franciscans of the Immaculate, starts off by saying that some of these Franciscans, according to this blogger, are drinking the radical traditionalist Kool-Aid. What is admirably charitable about that remark? That's a calumny.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
He's accused these fine Franciscan priests who are attached to the traditional liturgy of drinking Kool-Aid. It's a reference to the Jim Jones cult.
Yeah.
This is what Lawler considers admirably charitable? Please.
Yes, exactly. And in the course of that, as I say, he trolls the com sites. He talks about Rorate Coeli specifically, about the comments section of their sites. And, you know, I'm just curious, Chris, we have 4 or 5 fairly well-known, long-lasting, with good reputation newspapers and magazines in the traditional Catholic movement in America. We have the Remnant. We have Latin Mass Magazine, Catholic Family News, The Angelus, you name it. Why don't these fellows ever come to us and ask what the official sort of mainstream traditionalist position is? Why do they rely on com boxes, whereas we all know some and many com boxes tend to attract those who seem to be hiding from their parole officers. They don't use their real names. They don't identify themselves. Why is that being given credibility, and yet nobody in the traditional Catholic press, starting with me, the editor of the oldest traditional Catholic newspaper in this country, they never, not only do they not approach us, Chris, but they won't invite any one of us to come on to their Catholic Answers Live or any of their blogs and actually give an accurate and fair position of what the traditionalists think and are saying.
You want the answer to your question? They're cheap shot artists. They like to take cheap shots, and I'll prove it to you. When public broadcasting, now PBS, wanted to do a piece on the Shortford pilgrimage, they went to John Rao. When BBC wanted to talk about the traditionalist movement in the Catholic Church, they called me up, and I participated in a show on the BBC. You were invited to participate. Which was the network that contacted you?
Yeah, the Canadian Broadcasting Service about the beatification of John Paul.
Called you up, and they treated you with respect, and they gave you a forum in which to air the legitimate traditionalist position. Even the mass media recognizes, as the London Economist has pointed out, that it's trendy now to be a traditionalist. And that traditionalists are the avant-garde in the church because they're trying to bring back the past in terms of liturgical tradition and catechetical tradition and priestly formation that was abruptly discarded 50 years ago. The secular press can see that something has gone wrong in the church and that the avant-garde of traditionalists are seeking to restore what we have lost. And yet these characters at Catholic Answers, Patrick Coffin, for example, who practices magic when he's not taking cheap shots at traditionalists, are spending hour after hour talking about some people, as you say, who make indefensible comments in com boxes. You have kooks in every movement. Why focus on the kooks? Focus on the mainstream of the traditionalist movement, which is trying to undo the immense damage that has been done to the church in the name of opening the windows to the world and accommodating the church to modernity. That project is a catastrophic failure. It's obvious.
Everyone knew what Pope John Paul thought of altar girls. He was opposed. He was against it for many, many years. When he was forced into it finally, to allowing it in certain areas where it was already the custom or the tradition, the neo-Catholics, instead of remaining loyal and defending the position of John Paul, just basically gave up on the whole struggle to keep a male priesthood starting at the level of the altar servers. And they've been kind of doing this at every step of the way, these neo-Catholics.
Sure, well, yeah, whatever novelty becomes customary and is adopted, they embrace. And so even though they may be pious individually, they may be model Catholics, they may have large, beautiful families, all of that is true. Problem is that in practice, they've accepted novelties that have undermined the faith, and the results of that undermining are there to see. Mm-hmm. Again, Cardinal Ratzinger spoke of a continuing process of decay in the church. since the Second Vatican Council. When are they going to admit the obvious? The project of attempting to reform the church and bring it up to date with the modern world is a disaster.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
you know, this one blogger you mentioned says that we traditionalists have this attitude of superiority. We think we're the A team and Novus Ordo Catholics are the B team. I'm quoting from his blog site. I don't need to embarrass the man by naming him. He's got it wrong. He doesn't understand what we're really saying. We're all part of the same team. He distinguishes Novus Ordo Catholics from traditional Catholics. He uses the term Novus Ordo Catholics on his website. He doesn't see that he's put his finger on a massive, unprecedented problem, that there are now two camps in the church, Novus Ordo Catholics and traditional Catholics. When was that ever the case in church history? The problem is not that we think we're the A team and Novus Ordo Catholics are the B team. The Novus Ordo Catholics and the traditionalists are all on the same team. What we're saying is the team has stopped playing its A game. A game is tradition, the traditional formation of priests, the traditional Roman liturgy, traditional catechesis, traditional Catholic education, traditional nuns in traditional convents, traditional monks following the traditional rules of their orders. All of that has been thrown overboard. We're not playing the A game anymore. The team is losing because it's playing the B game. Novus Ordo novelty.
That's right, and as you've pointed out, I think rightly so, fairly enough. I mean, the neo-Catholic folks, spokesmen, oftentimes like, and to their credit, I appreciate these stories too, but they really like to stress the conversion stories, the story of journey and so forth, and the process of becoming a Catholic. Well, that's wonderful, and I celebrate that as well. But there's such a disconnect, and that is in that the church has abandoned any effort whatsoever to have people in the Catholic Church actually striving to bring people to conversion, to bring them to the Catholic Church. Starting, as you know, with Cardinal Casper himself. They've abandoned this idea of trying to convert those who are not Catholics and bring them into the Catholic faith in order that they might be saved. They don't. The new church, quote unquote, doesn't say that anymore. Doesn't speak that language anymore.
Well, this is the problem. The neo-Catholic commentators who are lay people speak of conversion stories and coming home to Rome and all of that traditional sounding stuff, yet they have no problem with the ecumenical movement. But according to Cardinal Casper, the ecumenical movement spells, and this is his word, the abandonment of the previous teaching of the Church, that the only way to Christian unity is, as Pius XI put it in his encyclical Mortalium Animos in the 1920s, the return of the dissidents to the one true church. You can't have Christian unity unless those who rebel against the church's authority and their descendants today recognize that there was one church and return to it.
That's right.
So the neo-Catholics say, welcome home, coming home to Rome. But the hierarchy, the leaders in the church, including Cardinal Casper, Cardinal Cassidy, and so many others, have abandoned this approach. They refuse to say that the non-Catholic Christian has an obligation to convert and return to the one true church.
Yeah, to the extent of practically blocking 400,000 Anglicans that wanted to come into the Church of Rome. You remember a couple years ago.
Yeah.
You know, so it's out of hand. Now, why don't we? Now we've defined neo-Catholicism fairly succinctly. I'm going to have to add to that, I'm sure. But now let's just move over to traditional Catholicism. And I wonder if you could start with Notre Charge Apostolique of Pope Pius X, where he talks about the true friends of the people, to try to give our neo-Catholic brothers, and I do mean brothers, a better understanding of who and what we are as traditional Catholics. Take it from there.
Well, whereas the neo-Catholic is an analog of the neo-conservative in politics, he's sort of conservative, but he's liberalized, and perhaps doesn't even know it. The traditionalist is like the paleo-conservative in politics. He has simply kept the faith. A traditionalist is nothing other than a Catholic who went on worshiping and believing just as his ancestors did for century after century after the Second Vatican Council. And there isn't one word in the teaching of Vatican II that requires any Catholic to change one iota of his faith, or to abandon any of his traditional practices, or to abandon the traditional liturgy. Benedict vindicated the entire traditionalist position when he said in Summorum Pontificum that the traditional Mass, last codified in the 1962 Missal, was never abrogated. I repeat, never abrogated. And in his explanatory letter to the world's bishops that accompanied Summorum, he explained not only that the traditional Mass had never been abrogated, but that, and I quote, it was in principle always permitted. I repeat, always permitted. That's what we were saying for well nigh 50 years, to the mockery of the neo-Catholic gallery. And then lo and behold, the Pope confirmed that Paul VI did not, and in fact could not, prohibit the traditional liturgy. It would be unthinkable for a Pope to do that. And Benedict was intent on absolving Paul VI of that charge and rectifying probably the greatest injustice in the history of the Church, the illicit attempt to create the impression that the traditional Mass had been banned. So we traditionalists are those who simply went on practicing the faith and believing as Catholics have always believed, and there was no reason on earth or in heaven not to do that. That's what we are, Catholics.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, we go back to that I think, very historic statement of Pope Benedict XVI on February 14, 2013, this year, where he talks about that very thing. He accuses, or he tries to attach blame to the media, what he calls the media council. I don't think that we need to concentrate or focus on what Pope Benedict, what he believes is the cause of the sort of cataclysmic results of Vatican II. What's important is he does believe that out of Vatican II comes this terrible period where seminaries close. He actually uses the word trivialized with respect to the Roman Rite, that the Mass has been trivialized since Vatican II.
You should draw that point out a little bit in this conversation for people who perhaps are not familiar with the statement he made in his address to the Roman Curia, where he blames a virtual council. In other words, this has something to do with Vatican II. He would insist that it's not the literal texts of the council, and an argument can be made for that. But he definitely attributes to at least a virtual council, and these are his words, so many calamities, so many disasters, seminaries empty, convents empty, the liturgy banalized. Now, he's saying that a council of the media, or a virtual council, seized upon the documents of Vatican II and gave them an interpretation which led to these calamities, these disasters, the emptying of the convents, the emptying of the seminaries, the banalization of the liturgy. But, nevertheless, there is a council that opened itself to this possibility, and the result has been a disaster. No council in the history of the Church has ever led to such a catastrophe. Nor has there ever been a council where we need a hermeneutic of continuity in order to reconcile what the council teaches with what was taught by all previous councils. The council itself is supposed to provide a hermeneutic of continuity.
I'm gonna interrupt you right there, Chris, because on the list of this blogger that we mentioned earlier, one of the lists on the list, one of the things that he includes about radical traditionalists is that we reject Vatican II. Now let's put an end to this right now. And what you just started to say, and I'm going to ask you to continue saying it, gets right to the meat of that issue. We do not reject Vatican II, but there are problems inherent, at least with the interpretation of Vatican II. You have popes now saying we need somehow to interpret this in light of tradition because something has gone wrong. So carry on.
Let's bury that 6 feet under once and for all.
Right.
Traditionalists do not reject Vatican II. Repeat. Traditionalists do not reject Vatican II. It was obviously a validly convoked ecumenical council of the Church. The traditionalist position is simply that which has been explored in the masterwork of Romano Amerio, I Ota Unum. And by the way, there was just recently a symposium in Rome at a pontifical university celebrating this work. Or the critiques of Monsignor Gherardini, a master theologian, a respected authority, the holder of a very high position in the Vatican bureaucracy. Or the position of Cardinal Ratzinger himself, writing his father Ratzinger, who said of Gaudium et Spes, the centerpiece of this whole attempt to bring the Church up to speed with the modern world, that in places it is downright Pelagian. That's Father Ratzinger, later Cardinal Ratzinger, and then Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, saying this in a criticism of one of the council's key documents. The problem with Vatican II is not that it isn't a valid council. The problem is that there are ambiguities in these texts. There are unprecedented pastoral formulations that have caused no end of difficulties for the Church, and these problems have to be resolved. The previous Pope called for a hermeneutic of continuity.
Right, so really, in what sense is there any difference between what the traditionalists have always said, and I'm talking strategically now, and what Pope Benedict was saying all along with the hermeneutic of continuity. In other words, if there is a hermeneutic of continuity, we want to find it too, just like Pope Benedict was saying that there must be, and it must be interpreted in light of tradition. That's what we want too. That's what Bishop Bernard Follet of the Society of St. Pius X is asking for. Please, show us how to reconcile Vatican II with tradition. Essentially, that has been the entire traditionalist position on Vatican II. Just show us, because we're confused.
Newsflash for the Neo-Catholic gallery. Archbishop Lefebvre was a council father. He attended the council. He subscribed to all of its documents. He even later subscribed to the decree on religious liberty, although he obviously had severe misgivings about it. And later, of course, Archbishop Lefebvre was harshly critical of the council because he could see what the ambiguities in those texts had produced for the church. The very crisis that Benedict says now requires a hermeneutic of continuity. When in the history of the church have we needed a hermeneutic of continuity to understand how a council fits in with tradition? But again, we don't deny the validity of the council. The arch-traditionalist Marcel Lefebvre was a council father. So let's have an end to that once and for all.
But let's just bring up to the next point that he says, which is that we reject the new Mass. And I think that's really important as well, because there's never been a rejection of the new Mass from the traditionalist position. Michael Davies, who wrote the book on the problems with Pope Paul's Mass, does not reject the Mass. So for a blogger, for a person of influence, to say traditionalists reject the new Mass, out of hand, just leave it at that. When you have books this thick written by Michael Davies, the premier apologist for traditional Catholicism, about the new Mass, that do not reject the new Mass, but rather point out what the problems and failures are of that Mass, this is disingenuous. And this is something I think we need to call our neo-Catholic brothers on and say, no, this is the position the traditionalists have on the new Mass. Go ahead, carry on.
It's not a question of rejecting the Mass as a rite of Mass. Obviously, the traditionalists mainstream would affirm the validity of the Mass. No one denies that it confects the sacrament. The problem is not that we reject the Mass, the new Mass, as a Mass, but rather that for very good reasons, which should be obvious now to anyone who attends the Novus Ordo Mass in a typical parish, because it leads to the erosion of faith in the real presence, because it is filled with innovations and even departures from its own liberalized norms that undermine the whole idea of the Mass as a sacrifice. And thus, it undermines, in practice, Eucharistic piety itself. Isn't that obvious? Doesn't anyone in possession of his senses see that? I mean, you have 3 million people on a beach in Copacabana grasping for the Eucharist, from a cup, a plastic cup filled with hosts, being distributed by someone who looks like he's a bus driver, not a priest. I had a shot from the Mass in Copacabana of the 20 or 30 people all reaching desperately for the plastic cup so they can get their host. But one of them is standing there looking at her smartphone while communion is being distributed right in front of her.
Yeah, here's the question, Chris. Where do we see those things going on at, I don't know, EWTN, for example? They're not. In other words, EWTN, by the liturgies that they present every day, most of them in the Novus Ordo are as beautiful as you can find in the Novus Ordo, are essentially saying the same thing. There's an implicit indictment of all the craziness you're describing here, and we're seeing it at the parish level all the time. So the neo-Catholics are saying, yeah, we're not going to go there. That is pretty crazy. The traditionalists are saying, why did we ever start down this road to begin with? Why don't we go back to the traditional Latin Mass of our fathers and our great fathers and the fathers of the church, for Pete's sakes, and leave it at that? This experiment has simply gone wrong.
That is an excellent point. They would deplore some of the worst excesses of the Novus Ordo. And yet, they cover with great admiration at the wonderful effect of this tremendous event, the Papal Mass on the beach at Copacabana, where the Holy Eucharist is being distributed in plastic cups, and people are disrobing immediately after Mass and jumping into the ocean for a post-Mass swim. This is an abomination.
Yeah.
And what do they say about it? Nothing. They spent 2 hours talking about some nut on a comm box on a traditionalist website.
I guess what you just said, though, Chris, fits in with another point on the our blogger friends list, and that is to have that concern about the bikinis jumping in, bikini-clad girls jumping in the water after receiving. That's the concern of what he would call the Amish Catholic. There's this equation between traditionalists and the Amish.
This is what we're talking about when we say that the neo-Catholic, without recognizing it, has been liberalized through and through. He is now a liberal Catholic. He sees nothing wrong with 3 million people attending a Mass where the Holy Eucharist is distributed in plastic cups and women jump into the ocean in their bikinis. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
He's been transported into a state of basically a Protestantized form of Catholicism, even though, as I have to emphasize, he believes as propositions everything the church teaches. And he even follows church teaching in his personal life. He may be perfectly moral.
Right.
Yet he's been liberalized.
And leaving their theology aside, obviously, why are we beating up on the Amish again? What, they don't listen to enough Lady Gaga? What's the deal? You know.
We have a world steeped in cultural degradation. The entire Western world is plunging into an abyss, and they make fun of the Amish people. Well, but this is their smarmy, liberalized mentality, which they're afflicted with, again, perhaps without even realizing it. They have become liberals. They're ecclesiastical liberals.
That's right.
And again, we've never seen this development in the church before the council, where the so-called mainstream of the church now dabbles in novelties and puts up with innovations that the preconciliar popes would have been reduced to apoplexy if they saw them.
That's right. We had tried, you and I and most traditionalists that I know, certainly in leadership or writers and priests and so forth, had tried so hard in 2007 to embrace our brothers who were from the neo-Catholic persuasion after the Summorum Pontificum was released, and it didn't seem to work. And now what we're seeing since the abdication of Benedict XVI, again, is a ratcheting up of the attacks against traditional Catholics. This is a polarization that cannot help the church, that cannot possibly help souls, especially in a day and age when, as we all know, all things Catholic are facing persecution in the very near future. This sort of in-house, counterproductive squabbling must come to an end, which is the point of this sort of informal show that we hope to present, and we want you, Chris, to be a part of, to try to bring people together and prepare for persecution to keep the faith in the days that come.
Let me add this thought to our neo-Catholic friends who can't seem to get off the subject of radical traditionalists. Newsflash to you, your house is burning down. It's collapsing all around you. Stop worrying about a few people who have fled the burning building and start doing something to put out the fire in your own house.
That's right. That's right. And I know you travel around the country and all around the world, in fact, doing lectures and discussions, as do I. I'm going to volunteer you right now for the moment, since you're our guest, to people like Patrick Coffin, to Catholic Answers, to people on the blog sites and EWTN. If they want the true traditionalist position, the position that the majority of traditional Catholics actually pay subscription dues every year in order to read. You know what I'm saying? There's a certain credibility attached to that, to those who are involved with the traditional Catholic press, with writers like yourself. I'm going to volunteer you and to say to Catholic Answers and to folks like that, please, anytime, Chris Ferrara is available to come on your programs and give you the other side accurately.
I double dog dare you.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, it's been a real pleasure. I hope this continues now forever. We'll try to do this once a week, 30-minute conversation, off the cuff, unscripted, and we really appreciate having you on board.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Look forward to it.
All right. Talk to you later.
Take care.
Yeah. Keep the faith.